Hi there. My name is Betty Yu, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the residency I did with KODA this past fall on Governor's Island, and share a little bit about the show that I was a part of, showing my work in progress. But I wanted to share a little bit about who I am as an artist and the way that I would like to just kind of share that is through some of my previous work. A lot of my work is actually through my own personal lens as a child of two immigrant garment workers, low-income garment workers from China and Hong Kong, as well as through the lens of someone who has grown up in a really diverse community in Brooklyn, in New York City that's being gentrified. So a lot of my work is through my personal lens, looking at displacement, gentrification, immigration, and sort of through that lens of how that kind of really has formed me as who I am as a person, but also really looking at the character of New York City and how that is actually changing quite a bit because of displacement and gentrification. So I will share some slides with you and then talk about the residency. So I wanted to first start with a really brief land acknowledgement, because there's, we can't talk about gentrification and displacement and even immigration without really paying respect to the first inhabitants of Brooklyn, of New York City, and of this country, really, right? Which are the First People Nations. But particularly in the borough of Brooklyn, it was the home to the First Peoples Nation of the Lenape Algonquian people, and Canarsie was an ethnicity within the Lenape. And so I was born and raised in Brooklyn, and I am here talking to you from a place in Brooklyn, which is Canarsie land. We must pay respect to the Lenape peoples past and present and future, and their continuing presence and struggle on their homeland. No conversation about gentrification and displacement can be had without first acknowledging that we all stand on occupied Lenape land in New York City that is unceded territory. So I just wanted to start with that. So the first project I just wanted to share, as I mentioned, my parents are garment workers who worked in Chinatown, New York City for over 35 years. And this is this piece here is a combination of some work I've been working on for many, many years. It's called Invisible Labor and the Garment Worker. And this is an install image from a show at Squeaky Wheel upstate of Buffalo in New York City. And basically it's an interactive piece. So depending on how you operate the sewing machine, whether pushing the pedal or turning the stitching wheel, you see different videos and different stories of garment workers, including my mother and my grandmother who has passed away, but I documented also her journey as a garment worker. And you could hear about the stories around wages and their fight to improve the conditions. And then I also incorporated some of my grandfather's story, who was also a labor activist that I found out much later. But that was in the 30s in New York City. So I have different generations of my family here in the US, but because of Chinese exclusion, a law that was passed in 1882, a lot of them couldn't stay here. So my roots actually go back to my great grandfather here. But I say I'm a child of immigrants because they were the generation that were able to come and stay. So anyway, this is my grandfather's story, and I call it Invisible Labor in Chinatown to honor a lot of the folks who did organizing in New York City who were Chinese American, and this is my grandfather. So that was also incorporated into this work. So I showed this work in several places, and I just wanted to show some of the work that I've done in the past 10 years, but this was a show recently, earlier in the fall of 2021, and it really, the show was in Chinatown, self-organized show, and you can see here the video that I produced and just archives the organization he started called Chinese Hand Laundry Alliance of New York was actually targeted by McCarthy during the 50s. So a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment and also anti-organized labor. And so collages and video and a lot of actually ephemera that I've collected that I was able to show, and people could pick up the phone and hear stories. My grandfather has passed away a long time ago, but stories from other laundry workers, hand laundry workers. I just show a few more install images. So this is back, it's the other one was in Chinatown. This one's upstate New York at Squeaky Wheel. And you can just see the iron is actually one that was actually passed on from my grandfather on the bottom right here. And, again, Chinese exclusion posters that I printed on t-shirts, sort of white, I call them white supremacists, but white laborers who on the West Coast was rallying, right, to exclude Chinese. And then the other project that has really influenced my pathway to the residency that I just finished with KODA is Displaced in Sunset Park. So briefly, it's an interactive multimedia project that really explores urban gentrification and displacement on longtime residents, workers, and small businesses in Sunset Park. It's a working class neighborhood that I grew up in, like I said, in Brooklyn, New York City. And what, my first iteration of this, I was able to show it at Open Source Gallery, which is more of a community-based space. And many people, I use this as a way to actually introduce this idea of mapping and counter cartography, because many people didn't know that 17th Street and like around 6th Avenue, which is where the gallery is actually part of Sunset Park. And so right where the highway is, right, that's a whole nother story of urban renewal and displacement. But anyway, a lot of folks said, oh, this is South Slope. And I was using this as a way to explain how South Slope is actually more a newer term used because Park Slopers, people who want to live in Park Slope were priced out. And so they moved into Sunset Park, but to make it sound hipper, the real estate developers, created this new term about 15 years ago. So anyway, people were able to kind of bring stories to life using augmented reality as a way to bring those stories to life. So I created this whole mapping project where people could take a physical walk or through the internet. I had a simple Google Maps story to show the stories of workers, of residents, small business owners, teachers, people who worked in the neighborhood, and how displacement has really, gentrification has really impacted the community. So this is just an example of, there's no sound actually here. You don't need to hear the sound. But for instance, this work in progress condo, right? You can click on it and you could hear a story of someone who grew up around the corner, for instance, Tari Hum, who's a scholar, and she talks about how now that was the supermarket that everyone went to, that my parents, that I went to growing up, and now it's this condo. So you can kind of, the idea is that you can kind of explore these stories. Oh, sorry, let me just go to the next slide. So this is just install images that I'm going to move through fairly quickly, but again, through my personal lens, you can, hear these stories. I interviewed about 20, it's an ongoing project, of course, but at some point, I had to figure out how to present this. But at the time of presenting this, I had about 20 stories that I shared from Puerto Rican, Dominican, Chinese American residents. And a lot of my work is research-based, like I said. So on the bottom right, you see these maps that I've sort of accumulated and look at from really the late 1800s to now, and how neighborhoods have changed and shifted, and how redlining, racial exclusion has actually impacted the neighborhood, and why is it, Latino and Asian and African American communities often live side by side. It's because of those redlining maps from the 1930s. So I kind of go through that as a way to tell, sort of counter that narrative of, around housing and displacement. So these are photos that people would give me. On the top left, for instance, he's in his 70s now, but a Puerto Rican man, Alfredo Lopez, moved there with his wife in Sunset Park in the 70s to help start one of the chapters of the Puerto Rican Liberation, Puerto Rican Socialist Party groups. It was very vibrant, very, sort of multilingual. Now it's mainly Central Americans that live there. And he mentioned that there's like about 31 languages or so in the neighborhood because of the indigenous languages also from South America, particularly Mexico, of immigrants that are residing there. And again, all at risk of being displaced because of this big called Industry City. It's this big $1 billion complex that opened up by the waterfront. And also you have Chinese investors that have been investing in the Chinatown part of the neighborhood. So these are activist talks that I organized back. This is back when we were able to do things in person. And then I led a placekeeping walk in Sunset Park where people could use their phones to activate the stories or put their phone on the actual location while we were walking and see stories on their phone. And this was the newsprint that people were able to take with them. So if they didn't want to do the walk right away, they could come back and do it on their own. And then this was like one of the stories, but you could also experience this if you're not in New York City from somewhere else through the internet. And I'm gonna actually not share this video in the interest of time, but all these stories are also accessible online. And I also have my own personal story that I share because I think it's always really important to start with the personal lens and have people who are watching identify with you and identify with why you are actually interested in this issue of displacement and gentrification, particularly in the neighborhood I grew up in. And then these are just some install images from the BRIC Biennial in the Brooklyn Arts Center in downtown. And I was able to, include a lot more personal photos and images. And then these organza banners that are hanging are actually of redlining maps and some quotes from Ta-Nehisi Coates' Case for Reparations, which was an article that he wrote for The Atlantic back in, I forget, 2015, that really influenced me a great deal. And of course, the redlining maps, as we all know, were racially coded, parts of neighborhoods that were considered red and dangerous, right? When there were people of color, particularly African-American folks. And of course, the green meant, which in New York, in Brooklyn, Bay Ridge was the only non-redlined neighborhood because that didn't have one single person of color, or they call literally on the bottom right here, it lacked a single foreigner or Negro, which is in their language in 1934, which meant it was a highly graded neighborhood and you could get the best loans and this kind of thing. So I really tied that to, housing, obviously, to how we're seeing this racial exclusion and the wealth gap that has permeated throughout our country and has led to a lot of other issues, right, around housing and healthcare, education, and in general, a racial justice issue, really. So the last thing before I share slides from the residency is Chinatown Art Brigade. So I'm a co-founder of Chinatown Art Brigade. We're a group of Asian American artists, activists, scholars, researchers who really are very strongly tied to New York City's Chinatown, but specifically, we've been really impacted by gentrification in our community. So a lot of our practices is about collaborating with those impacted by racial, social, and economic inequalities and having them be a central part of the media making process. So far, our focus has really been, like I said, on Manhattan's Chinatown and looking at how not only, how art and real estate has played a role in displacing folks in Chinatown, but how the role of government, really city planning, has really played a huge role in the last 15 years in displacing people, evicting elders. Chinatown in Manhattan is largely 75% elders, immigrant, non-English speaking elders who are in very fragile, precarious situations. But this is our group of folks on the roof of a tenement building. This is a dinner. We did a whole series of workshops where people would tell their own stories about displacement and about their being uprooted from China or parts of Asia some from Malaysia who are of Chinese descent, Hong Kong. But coming to the US, trying to find that golden mountain, people talk about the paths paved with gold, but only to find a life of struggle, working very long hours. They are often separated from their family sometimes, and then they're often displaced every couple of years in Chinatown, living in really small boxes, right? But even then they can't afford that and they have to move around. So we did a lot of mapping. People shared their stories of places that were really important that are still around in Chinatown and places that are no longer around. So people here sharing, what happened to, the stores, what happened to, on the right is actually now a fitness gym that used to be a building of garment factories that one of the tenants that led the walk used to work in for 20 years. So really kind of really trying to really encourage that kind of artistic and creative expression. So apologize. So a lot of the art and mapping kind of led to images and stories for our projection that we end up doing. So as you can see, we did several projections in Chinatown, and you can see here on the left, it's on a condo sign that says, "Who did you displace?" Who did you displace so that you can live in your luxury condo? And so we were trying to reach not just the individual, we also talked about policy change, but to try to really pull at the heartstrings of individuals too, that may be thinking about what side how they can be an ally, but mainly to reach out to other tenants who are Chinese speaking. And so the right here is a Chinese song that was rewritten. The tenants rewrote it as a karaoke song to look at anti-displacement issues and to call out greedy landlords. So you can see here some images here from our past projections. And this happened to just, the bus was just going by as someone wrote this, which was kind of a sort of a perfect confluence of events timing wise. So this is where people could write on something called People's Pad, and it would be projected onto the wall pretty large. And so we collaborated with the Illuminator. The Illuminator is a group that travels around New York City. They came out of Occupy Wall Street, and they really support movement struggles using their projection van. And so people were writing messages, of solidarity. And then that sort of turned into the 2.0 version of Housing for the People mapping project. And so what we did was mapping out, again, people's stories, continuing the mapping, meeting with tenants, asking them what were important spaces that we should add that might be missing, because we were working on different iterations. And then finally, creating a digital map. These were more conversations that we were having with tenants. And this is kind of in progress images, as you can see. And then we had a launch event actually, and this was from support from the Laundromat Project 2 years ago, where we're able to make a huge vinyl replication of a map where people could actually use augmented reality and bring the stories to life. So on the map here on the left, you can see people could aim their phones onto the map and the stories could be brought to life. And so these are just images of another event that we had of stories where people could bring the stories to life through their phones. And so this was the last movie theater that's now a hotel, and people just through personal stories, recollections, is how we were able to construct those videos. And then this is one of the maps, web-based interactive maps. And so you can see here, this is the hotel on Bowery, 93 Bowery, that is what it is now. People would augment it and they would see this. This is what it was in 1978. And then a video would come up. And then again, another huge hotel. This is a hotel at 50 Bowery that used to be the first unionized restaurant in Chinatown in the 80s and closed down a little bit ago, about 10 years ago. So so people could bring the stories to life. And then we had a history of the timeline of the organizing of our partner group, which is CAV, their Chinatown Tenants Union, and also their anti-police brutality and worker organizing that they did over the last 35 years. And then I wanted to end, of course, with the KODA residency. And this past fall of 2021 on Governor's Island, I had the opportunity to do this residency. And as I mentioned, a lot of my work really in the last 10 years, I would say, has really been looking at people's personal stories and histories as a way to talk about placekeeping, counter cartography, meaning, creating a people's map or, people's history of stories from places that may be hidden from, or maybe be completely absent purposefully from these maps that we sometimes consider as very legitimate, right? But they're actually erasing certain narratives, right? So those dominant narratives often erase people of color and immigrant folks and working people who really laid the groundwork for this country, right? And so I'm just going to share some images and then talk through a little bit from a statement that I had actually up at the show, that I was able to show work that I produced through this residency at 5 Miles. But I'll just read this so that you can get a sense. So these are some working images, some work in progress images, from my residency on Governor's Island, which I know Swale was the partner group. And I was able to just use that time, really meditative and reflective time to do a lot of research, space to just map things out, project, experiment with projections and things, because this is a work in progress and I'm thinking about other ways I can tell the story. So this project is called Mapping Indigenous, Black, and Asian Resistance in New York City. It's a work in progress that is a multimedia installation that really honors the undertold stories of decolonization, liberation, and uprisings against white supremacy, led by people of color on Lenape land, currently known as New York City, spanning the last 400 years. The installation currently features 3 organza banners and a 75-minute video, which I will get to. But I started working on this, as I mentioned, of course, with KODA, as a recipient of the KODA residency on Governor's Island. The project has provided a critical outlet for me as I reflect on this last 2 years of racial justice uprisings in the wake of the police murder of George Floyd and in the face of COVID-related anti-Asian violence. As a longtime activist and avid student of history, I know that the white supremacist power structure has always pitted us against one another, people of color against immigrants, people of color against, poor working whites, people of color against, other folks. And of course, Indigenous folks are often even completely left out of that conversation. So I also know that Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latinx communities have a lot more in common than differences. So I wanted to provide a visual portal into those stories that are not rooted here in that are rooted here in New York City. I focus specifically in Lower Manhattan, which is a lot of where my organizing has been, and Brooklyn, of course, as a lifelong Brooklynite and someone who has deep roots in Sunset Park, Brooklyn in particular. But I use this as a way to also uncover histories I knew little about. And so just wanted to share that these, I had a book, if you can see here, Long Journey Home, which is a book of Lenape oral histories of people who, the Lenape, of course, during the Trail of Tears, 150 years ago, were being pushed westward, right? So a lot of them ended up in like Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and even Canada. But this book, which was written about 20 years ago, captured the stories of, folks who are already 20 years ago in their, maybe 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and how their parents and the grandparents shared with them stories of the displacement and what it was like to be uprooted from their homes on Lenape land, on their land, and the journey and the trauma. So these are two, so I pulled out several quotes several, people's stories, and I used them in this video, but also as study material for sure. And so I spent countless hours researching and looking through newspaper archives, books, records, desperately trying to find oral histories and direct accounts told directly through Indigenous, Black, and Asian voices, but found very little. So when there was a slave rebellion, for instance, or Indigenous uprising, it was almost always told through the colonizer, the oppressor's lens. And maybe sometimes I could find something that was through from a newspaper, but the more often than not, unless it was an abolition newspaper, the perspective of the author, of the journalist, was very skewed. So very rarely could I find an account from an empathetic witness or someone directly involved. Sadly, most of these uprisings ended in tragic death and execution. And of course, we know this is how the dominant narrative gets shaped and fed to us as the quote unquote official stories. And so, for instance, I didn't realize, this may be widely known in maybe in other circles, but Frederick Douglass, of course, when he escaped and became a free man, he came to New York City, and there was another abolitionist, David Ruggs, who took him in, right? And he had a place in Tribeca, African American freedman as well, took him in before he went on his journey to become obviously one of the most well-known abolitionists. So that's just a story of him. As you can see, I'm trying to play with the mapping. So it was just things like that I was uncovering. And the video really kind of is very much goes into depth around that. So I just wanted to share some other images. In fact, some of the people don't realize that, New York City at some point was the largest slaveholding state, second to Virginia at some point. And it wasn't necessarily large plantations that they were working on, but they were doing a lot of more industrial kind of jobs, working on the waterfront and things of that nature. And there were some small farms, but people like, Bergen, we hear Bergen Street, and Bergen as someone who contributed a lot to education in the neighborhood in parts of Brooklyn. Hans Bergen, for instance, he's in the middle here. He was one of the largest slaveholders, right, in this part of Brooklyn, but also kind of bringing out stories of hope and resilience. So Weeksville, right, which was a community kind of in Crown Heights, that one of the first free Black communities in New York City. And Weeksville is in the top 3 images you see here. There was like a few strips where these 3 fellows here standing in front of a business, right? So it was like, people talk about Black Wall Street, of course, in Tulsa, but there was a very vibrant community here of folks who, really self-sustain their own banking system, their own businesses, this kind of thing. So I wanted to bring out those stories, and then also bring out the Asian American resistance stories against labor exploitation and police brutality, and seeing how all these kind of interweave together, right? Because we often don't see these stories as kind of connected, but in fact, Asian communities have been very influenced by Black liberation struggles and Indigenous struggles against displacement and things of that. So I'll close by some of the images from the residency. Of course, I did this residency with Sari Carell, who also was part of the exhibit and the residency, and the exhibit was called Maps. But I just wanted to share some images as I just kind of read the last sentence from my, last paragraph rather, from my statement. So the stories I cite are not meant to be comprehensive or exhaustive, just a snapshot of what I've been working on. The stories span nearly 400 years, from the first account of enslaved people of African descent stolen from their homeland and forced onto New York soil in 1626, then organizing rebellions in 1712 and 1741 to the stories behind today's Astor Place, which was one of the largest Lenape gathering spaces known as Kente Koying, which is a major intertribal crossroads. And then also covering from Black resistance to Indigenous resistance to Asian resistance, where right around the corner by Astor Place was the founding of the Chinese Equal Rights League. It was one of the first groups formed in 1892 to fight for the equal rights of Chinese Americans at the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So my aim was to uplift these often undertold, parallel, and intertwined stories of resistance. So you can see here, this is an image of the building that I mentioned, which is around where Astor Place, where this organization was founded to fight Chinese exclusion. And they were very inspired by the equal rights, civil rights work that was happening amongst African Americans after abolition and fighting for voting rights and equal rights. I will close just with reading one statement from a Lenape member and just sharing some images from this video that that it's a 90-minute video. Obviously, you're not going to see, you're going to see just like a minute, 2 minutes of it. But that really looks at Lower Manhattan and again, Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn and stories of Indigenous, Black, and Asian resistance and mapping those histories. So I close with this quote from Chief Denise Stonefish Kikai, who is from the Council of Lenape delegation. And they visited New York City in 2019. There was a gathering of various folks from the Lenape Nation who came to New York City. And her quote here is, to me, very powerful. She says, "Both Blacks and Chinese are natural allies in our work to bring greater attention to our place in our homelands." So to me, that kind of really encapsulates a lot of, what this project is about, as far as looking at Indigenous, Asian, and Black resistance. And so the organza banners that I shared with you earlier in those images, each tell that story through the maps and then through faces and through some quotes. And so I'll just share another minute of this. And there's no sound on this. It's meant to be more meditative. And I'll share that the opening night of the show in December, one person, stayed and really watched, stood there for about an hour and watched this and shared with me that she is a part of some activism and organizing going on to preserve the Flatbush burial ground. So there are obviously a number of African burial grounds that have been uncovered in the last 15, 20 years. And this one in particular hasn't gotten as much attention. It's by Lefferts Garden in Flatbush. But she mentioned that she's a part of this fight to give it, to give it back to the people, to make the space. It's right now it's a community garden, and it's a space where they want to use it for community gatherings. She in this video, I point out this African burial ground that has not gotten as much recognition. And she mentioned she wanted to share the video. I shared the link with her, with people who are organizing around this as well, to preserve it, to bring it back to the hands of the people in the neighborhood and folks of African descent to use the space. And so she was very moved by that. So that was really powerful and meaningful to me, that she just stood there for so long. So this is me and my sister. So I some of this personal history in Chinatown in the 90s when I was like a baby in the organizing. So I'm just gonna scan through, as you can just kind of see a little bit of the other parts of history. This was from a 1982 garment strike, where about 15,000 garment workers protested for better conditions and for fair wages in the garment industry in Foley Square, which is where Chinatown is, and in Columbus Park. So it was pretty powerful. And then this last thing here, which, sorry, I think, yeah, is where, you know, Asian Americans were exposing the police brutality of an Asian man who was just actually calling out and trying to call out another police. So he got harassed and beat up because he was actually witnessing what was happening to a young African American man and calling that out to the police, like shouting, you know, calling them out. And so this led to a huge fight in the, you know, in the early 1970s. And then, yeah, hidden stories of places that we walk by all the time, churches in Brooklyn that have been very, very key in the abolition movement, you know, and then, you know, like I said, Weeksville, which was its own community run by freed Blacks at the time, which was really, really powerful. So I will just kind of end there. And I did some annotating. So some of the images I have just regular text, and some of them I you know, wrote on it on the actual images themselves, and just calling out some of the larger slaveholders in New York City, because New York City was a huge part of the whole industrial complex of slavery. Huge part, because that was where the port was, and that's where they came in through by Wall Street. And so I wanted to kind of really show how New York City, and New York City was one of the last northern states to end slavery. So really showing kind of showing the intertwined kind of histories of what we see now in neighborhoods and how they go way back hundreds of years. So I'll just stop there. Thank you so much for allowing me to show work. And I believe there will be links shared as well with this video so that you can check this out on your own. Thank you so much.